There's- Hi, I'm Pam Ponsalan, and I'm on the panel, well, the rehash panel for Devils for the Details for the Devil, a deeper dive into microsettings. I think some of you might be aware that we were here last year, and we're gonna kind of dig well deeper into things, I suppose. So I'm again Pam Ponsalan at the Dovetailer on Twitter. I am a queer Filipina based in Manila, doing design, editing, sensitivity reading, cultural consultancy, and a lot of community work. I'm also hashtag RPGC, proud to say so. I've I, I just have a lot of projects, thankfully. So I'll go into them some other time. But Richard, since you just got back, hello. Please introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Richard Ruane, and I am sorry I had to run to get something at the door. But I am my pronouns are he him, and I'm the creator of Barrow Keep and Dark Designs and Verdigris, and the upcoming Enoch's Wake, and the soon to hit to Kickstarter Moonlight on Roseville Beach. And I am at ARR_RRO on Twitter. So
All right. Because Zedeck is indicating me, I suppose. My name is Brian Yaksha. I live in Brooklyn. My pronouns are he and they. I've done work on Raquel, Best Left Buried, Brinkwood, Wormskin, Dolmenwood, Age of Sigmar, Soulbound, Chromatic Soup, some Pathfinder stuff official. And I recently had a big Kickstarter called Academies of the Arcane for the Melsonian Arts Council. I believe I just said that I live in Brooklyn. I'm a rural transplant, and I really, really want to get out of the coffin of an apartment I've been stuck within for almost 2 years straight.
Hi, I'm Zedeck Siew. I am a writer, designer, translator, editor from Politics in Malaysia. Yeah, so RPGC like Pam. With the Artist Macau, my current RPG project is called The Thousand Islands, which is a series of basically microsetting zines. And we're making our first book, and it will be on Kickstarter like really soon. So, Reach of the Roach God, check it out.
all right, Pam, do you? I don't know if you wanted to start with a question. I had like crazy number of questions just here, but we definitely want to like catch up a little bit, like sort of review what we did last year, and sort of real quick, just basic review from last year. What did we sort of like establish as what a microsetting is?
I can't recall what we.
I brought up the
I don't think we came up with a big unified answer. So,
which is a microsetting answer in itself.
Yeah.
I found the thread in which I answered all of the questions from last year, so I'm just gonna link that in the panel hangout, so maybe they can distribute that link.
Nice. And I think last year we also talked a little about sort of what that they're useful and interesting as they're useful and interesting because they are super focused on key details. And I think last year we talked about devil in the details. That the beautiful thing about microsetting is they require you to flush out so much so much insight about what's going on, what's going to like real specificity in a microsetting. Whereas as much as I love some of like the great wilderness guides, you really or things that that kind of have you wandering around like a very large piece of countryside. You don't get that level of specificity. You don't get into the details of life and how it's lived. And just over this past year, sort of what has kind of been inspiring you as sort of like examples of really digging into a setting and seeing specific details or pieces? what had been your inspirations over the past year? And then
Anybody want
Inspirations
to start?
generally.
Or
yeah.
yeah,
I
inspirations generally.
like
I've been thinking about.
so the like I've been like one of the books I finished reading most recently is basically a sort of ethnography of Bugis navigation. So like the Bugis peoples are a particular people from Indonesia, from the Indonesian region, and they are a maritime culture. And yeah, it just struck me that a lot of my work comes from sort of in sources like that. Sort of specific ethnographies of specific cultural practices, boat building. Food is a big thing. So like the sort of food cultures of a particular area or particular culture, and yeah, so like that's those are like sort of very clear and very specific inspirations for any of the zines we make. That it always comes from a sort of particular source, and a very it's not like an overview. You know, people, I I don't know whether you get this question a lot, Pam, but when people ask about, like, when people talk to us, they ask, "Oh, what can you recommend a thing that sort of introduces your uh
Yeah.
and you know, like, it's not that it's not that I don't understand where the question is from, but it's just that I can't recommend something because the general guide I don't know because I don't need it. And so it's an interesting thing where macro settings are kind of like that general guide, and whereas at least personally, my work is entirely focused on the sort of very specific thing. So yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, I do get that question a lot. Just to cut in real quick, and I'll follow up after you because that's a really good way for me to also get into my own micro setting stuff.
uh, yeah, yeah. So that's the kind of it's things that have been continually inspiring me throughout the.
So Zedeck very gracefully brought me in by talking about that question. And it struck me, for example, that I think just last week, Dagger Isle supplement, which is still untitled, by the way, and that's my fault, was announced under Evil Hat. And I mentioned a term, tropical goth. Now, a lot of people are apparently interested in it because they don't know what it is. And that's fascinating to me because that's literally the entirety of Philippine literature after 1500s. So I found myself struggling to explain that, and I'm going to write an entire blog post slash Twitter thing about it because my training is primarily academic and cultural studies. So when we mouth off a term, we have to think about all these nice fancy things like discourse, ideology, context, culture, tradition, and all that shit, right? So I was looking into it, and fascinatingly, tropical goth was defined by one of my own writers. So I was like, okay, I hit it on the nail. It's from my hood. Yet the academic discourse focuses on the global south, Latin America. So the book summary that I saw about tropical goth did not mention any Filipino writer at all. So now my exercise as a designer and also as somebody with a platform is, okay, how do I then describe what that is? And the things that came to mind for tropical goth is I'm going to introduce the idea of smallness. There is an essay by Nick Joaquin called A Heritage of Smallness. Now, I would not actually recommend it to anybody because it sounds really cool if you're 20 and you don't know any better. But I'm 36 and I've done some work, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people who are watching this have done some work too. So if you read it, it's gonna come off very the Filipino term is coconut. It's a brown man who's white underneath. So he makes some very weird conclusions about Philippine culture as a Filipino that has my eyebrows kind of doing the waggly dance, right? But the proper idea of smallness is an intense microscopic focus on things that may have to do, for example, with aesthetic, but also have to do with the lived experience. And macro guides can't really do that for you. They don't really talk about stuff like food. They don't really talk about how somebody's language sounds in a particular neighborhood or why a word comes up. So if you had a macro setting, for example, of urban horror Philippines, you'd say that Manila is a city of glorious noir. Strange things happen in the dark. And then you'd add a lot of interesting um, slogans, I guess. And you'd be able to mouth that off real quick for people to get a general idea of what they're getting into so they can go, okay, I like this book. Great, let's try it. On the other hand, a micro setting would delve deeper into what makes us a noir city. And the chilling example that I have for all of you this evening on your end and morning on mine is, did you know that the word salvage in English parlance for Filipinos has a different meaning than the rest of you? So most of you guys will think salvage, you salvage equipment, you put something back together, you go through a scrapyard and you figure things out. Salvage was the not so nice way of describing an extrajudicial killing under martial law. So when you say sinalvage siya, he, she, they were salvaged. And everybody knew down here what you mean. And then the other micro setting aspect of a Manoa city is there is a Tagalog. Not really, it's not really specific to Tagalog as far as I can tell, but I'll just say Tagalog so I don't sound regional. Ingat po kayo, which is please take care. It sounds like such a nice greeting, but I've been told by my elders that ingat po kayo for older Filipinos who survived martial law was them basically saying, take care, subtext, I hope you don't get shot by the popo. So those are very specific micro setting things. And if you as a designer are doing a larger setting, you don't need to concern yourself with that, right? You just have to give people the broad strokes that are gameable, quote unquote, so that it's useful for your players. But both for a GM and a player, in my experience, it is actually useful to have these small uh, I guess tonal notes, if you wanted to call it like music. Because if you don't have those, then how are you supposed to be able to make a compelling picture? What are you supposed to use as a player when you are a character in a world and that character knows the world, but you're on Earth right now in reality and you don't know fuck all about the actual setting. So that's my little thing about smallness and micro settings and specificity. As for general information, for general inspiration, the two games that I've been playing are FF14 and Genshin Impact, and they're amazing. And I could talk more about that, but I don't want to take up too much space because it also has some weird micro setting stuff. So
Uh, I think I'll go next because just sort of continue with a sort of a bummer trend of talking about some stuff. So, in a broader macro setting, it's yeah, let's just give in to some Western imperialism and expansionism and go out and manifest some destinies and purge some populations and not really think about it. And you know, that's fun if you don't think about it, and that's why people enjoy their Dungeons and or Dragons and other various games that don't make it the most overt thing that they're clearly doing. Whereas with a micro setting, like a project I was doing earlier this year, which I shelved because it was too depressing, it was like, let me think of all the various ways in which a person could become completely ousted from civilized society to the point where they think, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to hurt people for money becomes, the way in which you decide to conduct your life, and how that both is sort of a consequence of your being and an active choice that you continue, because you could just go, live in a hermit shack under some fallen trees and not be a predator in human form, but that's not what a protagonist is. because a protagonist is not an inherently positive thing. It's just something that drives forward action. And so on top of doing that, it would then fell into, what are all the ways I can describe a person that inscribe a sense of self-doubt in one's own appearances, even things that traditionally skew positive, and a sense of bitterness. So you could roll up, the most like masculine, manly man gonna go out there and fight the orcs type of hero, but using all of the various little listings that I wrote during the peak of the pandemic in a very depressed state. It's just like, yeah. So yeah, you're really strong and you got this cool sword, but you're, that woman you love, she's never gonna talk to you again because of the things that you do, and the way that the people in your platoon describe you in ways that can only be described as like acquiescing to a fascist aesthetic are things that you should probably take issue with. And you know that after all these things that you've just gone out of your way to butcher, and the revelation of like, yeah, there may be like a soul or something like that, but I can't subscribe to religion anymore because I have made too much blood and meat out of things that should also have that, and I don't know how to live with myself, but I don't want to die with myself, so I'm just going to go. And that's your, throw 4 or 5 of those in a party and you're gonna have a real good bad time. And that's what I do with micro settings, and a lot of people like to hire me for that. I swear I'm gonna write something happy at some point.
I just want to add really quickly as well that some people in the audience might have noticed that you've got already 3 people talking about imperialism and colonialism and stuff. And one of the things that we brought up last year, just to rehash and kind of go back to that discourse before we add more of our stuff, is inherently a micro setting can be about resistance, because many of us, or at least a lot of people who've been in tabletop a while, it's hard to argue against the shadow of traditional, so-called traditional tabletop role-playing games, or more specifically the role-playing game that is basically like Colgate to everybody, right? So World of Darkness, Legend of the Five Rings, D&D, all of that, right? And they do their things in large expansive books, but the critical reading of a lot of those a lot of the stuff is, it's basically white man fantasy when it comes to things like horror or fantasy or uh, mystic Japan. Suddenly remembered L5R and a chill ran down my spine, right? But that's the thing with these books. I think in a related thread about storytelling, I use the analogy of tourism. A macro setting lets you be a tourist in an imaginary world. So you can look at these things, you can say, oh, how pretty. And you will generally not let it affect you beyond letting it decide that you're happy that you spent money at this exotic culture for your further benefit. But you don't actually absorb what happens. You might not, you've consumed it, but you haven't digested it. A micro setting will force you by design to digest these things, because the random guards or the random orcs that you just killed had families, and they had a particular favorite meal, and they also had a bar that they used to go to every day, that sort of thing. So that's why we talk a lot about the framing of imperialism and colonialism in a macro setting, because inherently it can be that way because of how tabletop started with particular centers. And these days micro settings can be, I say can be, and maybe a form of resistance, because this does not always hold true. It just so happens that many of us designers in this space do that, whether we know it or not at times, or we do it deliberately. I don't know.
So can I sort of jump in and sort of tack on to what Pam was
Please
saying,
do,
because it's something that occurred to me recently through conversations with other people specifically. So I was on James Holloway's Monster Man podcast. So it's a podcast focused on discussing monsters and interesting things about monsters. And he got me to pick a particular monster, and I picked animals. And we sort of started talking about this, and even in Dungeons and Dragons, if you can sort of dismiss the basically overt text of it being sort of like going off and killing the killing the other. Even in there's an implication infused in it, even in the most innocuous things. For example, the difference between the ultra monster and the sort of mundane animal is a distinction that exists in the bestiary, in Dungeons and Dragons bestiaries from the very beginning, which is really a cultural assumption. Because if you think about sort of folklore and animals, the role of the animal in many folkloric traditions, they are hardly mundane. And so the idea of the mundane animal it's a very modern, very sort of I guess empirical, scientific sort of idea that is baked into Dungeons and Dragons. So when Pam was talking about, like the implication of the Tagalog phrase, or the sort of the meaning of the word salvage, the sort of our generic macro setting texts already have those things. They have culturally specific assumptions that are then universalized. So now it is basic because of the distinction between the animal and the animal and the monster. It is basically hard or even impossible even to tell like sort of European animal folklore stories in Dungeons and Dragons because it's such an scientific American text. Yeah, so like macro settings always have a center. They are often implicit, but they always have a center. So then, in a sense, a macro setting is a micro setting that doesn't know or doesn't care to acknowledge that it is one, which I thought was interesting.
Brian, I think you were about to jump in with something.
Oh yeah, no, I mean I've got a sort of a button for the just the inherent imperialism of talking about settings and stuff, and I mean yes, micro settings is a form of resistance. I would say probably the better way to think about it, if only because once again, not everyone who's writing one's going to necessarily want the mantle of having to be sort of an outlet of resistance in all
Yes.
things like that. That's not that I disagree with it, but once again, it's micro settings are about consequences because now you have to know and sort of care because there's enough attention to detail about this place. And I've recently been watching way too much Star Trek, and it's a lot of fun to go from place to place and see new things. But then you have Deep Space Nine, where it's like, guess what? You're the government. You're the local government. You don't get to just go away. Unfortunately, all these religious schisms and various political chicanery and aftermath of imperialism and genocide are things you're going to have to deal with week to week. So think about that rather than just being like the optimism of, well, I don't have to worry about these people that I just irreparably changed. Goodbye. Nope.
That's why DS9 is the best Star Trek series. I sorry for talking so long, but we were sort of talking about imperialism specifically. So something that we were doing internally with Thousand Islands. One of our internal sort of design documents is basically there are no white people here. There are no analogies to white people or the power of the European conquistador. And it was important for us to have that because our project it's intrinsically an exercise in recentering. Because Southeast Asia is, by definition, by its own name, a periphery. It's a term that was given to us by Americans. So what would the imagination where we are, or at least this region of this sort of imagination is centered, as opposed to like constantly feeling. So I guess this is a response to the idea that micro settings are resistance. They are resistant implicitly. I feel like they can be resistant implicitly by recentering where your imagination lies. So I don't want to think about the conquistador at all. You are not important to me, and that's a form of that's a deconstruction in itself, because throughout our history, throughout academic sort of historical and cultural life we've had to deal with in post-colonialism. So what would an uncolonial Southeast Asia look like? Not to say that it's without consequence, because cities still conquer, burn villages. But yeah,
Yeah, gosh, what would a Southeast Asia look like without colonizers, right? What a dream. Also, but even saying what a dream is an interesting exercise as well, because
Mm,
transcultural exchange and traditions still happen whether a colonizer was
exactly.
there or not, right? War
Mhm.
and imperialism aren't just about some outsider. You can literally
Mm,
tear each other apart just by being the same blood and not
yeah.
liking the way the one guy's face looks, right? So, it's it's an impossible exercise, isn't it? Doing this whole recentering away from what people understand to be a center. But the point
I
is to
feel that
try.
yeah, the sort of necessity of like sticking your finger into a dike that's slowly bursting. Because otherwise I mean, that's resistance, right? We have to. Who we are is resistance.
And just before people get like nervous that you always have to do this exercise, right? You don't actually have to always do this exercise. Just look at it this way. My face is colored. I am not white. My very existence is an affront to some people. Now, I don't have to do anything to be a rebel but breathe. And now that gives me power already, right? If somebody is offended by my face, well, fuck you. And that is again another. It may seem like we're talking a lot of theory, but again, it's not something that you could very easily decide to do or say that there is a textbook for it. We do have some questions and other things, other nitty gritty points that we can get into and how to like be more practical about it. But I
Oh,
think
that's
one of the reasons why we keep circling around this theoretically is it's a mindset. It's a mindset shift,
yes.
Yeah.
right? And if you don't change your mentality about it, you won't really be able to effectively design a micro setting where you will make, as Brian said, things matter to people, where consequences are heavier, where the dice rolls are going to hurt more, not just because of the results, but because of what it's going to do to these fictional people. And where agency is where you will feel the weight of agency, right? So
Yeah.
a mindset shift, right?
You have to be in a paradigm where someone's choice to actively perform violence needs to be something that nobody wakes up in the morning originally for the first time and says, I'm going to go commit a war crime. It's a long trek to get to that sort of person and to wear down the basic humanity they are instilled with from having existed as a person in a society, or even just as a person who existed outside of a society is like, wow, I wouldn't like anyone else to suffer through that. So you need to be in a situation when in the microsetting mindset of why does it make sense that these people are cruel and sadistic bastards versus the macro setting of, oh yeah, and this gang here, they're all cruel sadistic bastards. Go kill them for your XP and gold because that's fine.
So
Richard,
Brian, would you? Sorry.
no, please.
So I'm sorry to jump. I
No.
just hopped out of coffee. Brian, would you then sort of characterize microsetting writing as a kind of basically giving a full personhood to whatever you're writing about? Because
Oh, I really like that. Brian,
Yeah, I would say that that's certainly a decent way of putting it. I would say it's at the very least instilling a sense of personal empathy and integrity into that what you're writing about. Like I've long used as the example whenever I'm just getting really angry about someone who has written a really adequate but not great thing for a game, and it's just like, congrats, you wrote 100 things about rivers, but I don't care about this because this is just the generic river. Oh, there's a fish in it. Cool. If you made it about one river, and you made me care about this one river. You could have all that same information in there, but you'd be really celebrating something, and I'd be like, I love this. I don't care for the name of this river or where they've placed it, but I will use this because they've shown me why I should care about it. And I feel like that's certainly the fiction writing aspect of this that gets lost a lot in the game design aspect of this. Richard, what are your thoughts on microsettings? Because still in the introduction phase.
I think we're well past an introduction phase. I feel like we're like 2 graduate courses in, which is fantastic because
Yeah.
I think the thing I have really loved since last year about microsettings, and it was something that Pam said in kind of prep discussions, is that you and I think this plays also into imperialism, but you also don't see queerness in a macro setting because queerness happens too specifically on too small a level for macro settings to adequately really pick up.
Yeah.
Like there's if there's millions of people, you're just not going to get the specificity of people's lives, and
Yeah. I'm just, my brain went to the few
those
times I've seen it.
effects of imperialism. Yeah.
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 And it feels disingenuous almost when it's on that macro scale, because it's just like, yes, but you could tell me more.
Yeah, I will say really quickly that one of the works that I did, I can't help it. I'm queer. I'm queer as a rainbow, right? So of course I'm gonna put it into any setting that I'm hired to do, right? And it was interesting to have my editor say, you probably need to cut this section down. And I'm like, how do I cut this
No.
section down? I wish I could, right? And yet, oh, sorry, Brian, go ahead.
I'm just gonna, sorry for interrupting you, Richard. There's a tiny bit of chat lag, so every time I interrupted you, it was just like, let me fill this space.
But yeah, like I was gonna say as the last note for me for now. Interestingly, when my partner and I are deciding Nabithem, you won't really get a lot of things that explicitly say that the setting is queer, but you'll absolutely know it's fucking gay when you read it, right? So there's that because that's
Because
also. Oh, go ahead, Zedeck.
sorry, and it's something I think about a lot, not as a queer person myself, but sort of like trying to write settings where the queerness is not queer in the literal sense, where it is your people here. This is how people live, and if you come to that place, if you go to that place, you deal with it because the imperial mindset is like conquistadors going to any place in the world and thinking that their ducats will mean anything. And yeah, you want to write a place where like straightness has no meaning or is itself queer. And that's what a microsetting can implicitly do if you do it right. Yeah.
So I do have a question, kind of comboing a question from the audience and one that I had myself. I think when players become focused on or when you introduce players to your micro setting, because we're writing games, and at some point we will lose control of who's going to be in them. So when players get introduced to a micro setting, how do you hook them in and make them want to engage with that micro setting? I feel like D&D especially created a culture where even when you have a ton of world detail and you drill down into like the 5 cool villages in the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or whatever, everybody's all about leaving. Like, I'm getting the hell out of here. How do you hook them to stay and engage with a micro setting?
I can take this because I wrote a thing about that actually. One, random tables. Everyone likes a random table. They're fun. They can instill a sense of existing within the setting and be like, hey, this is my gimmick. And gimmicks get a lot of bad press, but gimmicks are fun. Everyone likes a gimmick. You just don't have a ton of them at the same time. I would say also it's a matter of instilling a sense of tone. So I wrote this article back when I was actively working on my Raquel stuff of here's all of these randomizers to determine exactly why nobody liked you where you're from and why you are exiled to this terrible northern hinterland. And the key facet of this is this backstory of a lived in life literally only matters if you decide it matters because nobody knows you here. So a lot of games, it's the power fantasy of you are, the big damn hero who's got the way too impractical broadsword that's going to cleave people in half. But having a setting that says you don't matter in any broad scale, you matter as much as you choose to matter and choose to make other people want you to matter is sort of, I would say it's a very freeing thing because now the players have the active goal of I want to control my own narrative and have people like me or believe this about me rather than I'm going to go do the good stuff and be a hero for it. So getting players invested by selling them the specifics of the tone of what it is they're now sort of ensconced within is so very rarely done in macro settings. I feel like the only time I've ever seen it done right is the old box set for Dark Sun, where here are 6 little scenarios that your players, depending on their class, can start in. Guess what? 10 minutes in, it doesn't matter. You're a slave, you're thrown in the blood pits, get to fight and get to kill, and you're a prisoner. And it's like, okay. But other than that, most of it's just like, yeah, you can do miracles and crap at level 1, so you lose that scale of scope, and that can botch tone. I feel like there was an answer somewhere in there. I'm gonna have some more water.
I think that how I get my players invested is it's more just figuring out, for example, what details in their character sheet and background and what they add in and kind of digging in on that and offering small hooks is how I tend to do it. I'm currently playtesting a game that is urban horror because it's been my preoccupation for the past 5-6 years putting this thing into a original system. And the by design it is a scaffold, so a macro setting that has a lot of small parts that people can focus on. So I have this entire section where, as a table, you decide the kind of theme that you want. And that is already starting investment early because that way people are like, okay, that sounds kind of cool. Let's do this. So some of the themes that I included in my urban horror were, do you want a family legacy story where all of you guys come from hunter clans and you don't only have to kill demons, you also have to deal with your tita who tells you you're fat every time you go have Christmas dinner, right? Do you want that kind of flavor? Or do you want you happen to be that one government agency overworked, underpaid in the third world country that is the Philippines, and now your government is like, you got to take care of some ghosts. By the way, you don't have body armor or purified salt, right? Or do you want a high school setting where all of you are training to be the next new heroes, fighting vampires out there, but also dealing with hormones? So then it becomes intrinsically interesting rather than you as GM or you as designer deciding, I want players to engage like this, that, 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 that. The mindset shift here is you don't get to decide everything. And you should not have to decide everything. So if you, a lot of folks came to me before saying, how do I get my players engaged? And my number one question to them was, how much are you letting them be engaged? Like, are you throwing an episode at them over and over again and having them react to it? Or are you asking them, how is your character feeling right now? And why? Because that is also another GM tool that I wanted to bring up. A lot of us, because we like telling stories or presenting a world, will say, your characters are feeling like this right now in the face of like a many-eyed creature. But are you sure that everybody's going to feel that way? Do you have to be that certain about it? You could simply present it. and describe what it looks like, right? And let your players decide how it is and respond accordingly.
I have sort of sorry. I've small counterpoint / caveat to that. I've actually found that telling rather than showing and leading, because we specifically in the West, just it's show don't tell. And obviously this is a little bit different than what you're saying. I have found it is so much more freeing to say, this is Marty, you know him, he's a dick. He has always
that
been a
too.
dick. And it's just like, you don't need to be like, why's this guy being a dick to me? I thought I was going to come in here and be his friend. But, Marty is like, what are you doing? He's like, fuck you, Marty. You still owe me money. And now it's just like, I will lean into that because Marty is a dick who would still owe you money. So, that's very much an aside for micro settings, more just general GMing. But yeah, if you're going to have those intimate casts of characters with preconceived relationships, it's totally fine to be like, yeah, this is a straight up fact that you know about this person.
That sort of draws from your sort of personal relationship with your actual friend who you're playing with. Because it occurs to me that that description is kind of like he's a dick, or rather, he is like your ex-boyfriend who ditched you last summer or whatever. And then there's an instant snapshot on how you instant cue to how one should relate to this person. Some about the I understand Richard, like the Richard's question, the way I understood it was so that this question of like increasing the sort of friction between the text and the players, and sort of like, how sticky can it be, both to players and also to the GM, because the GM is part of the playing thing, and they are the one who is engaging. That entire table has to engage with your text. So I basically am in agreement with what both Pam and Brian brought up. Like specific to something specific that we do in our zines. Is like, how do you get people engaged in a particular place when they arrive there, and how do you get the GM interested as well implicitly? A specific thing we do is there's no universal currency. Everybody's arriving, everybody's leaving, because that's just how the setting works. It's interconnected regions and islands. So there's no, your money is not good everywhere. So you got to figure out what's good here. And so in every zine, we'd always have a list of trade goods. So it's figuring out, it's the idea that you are traveling from somewhere to somewhere else. So what do you have to give this place? And what does this play in exchange? Because then you'll be traveling somewhere else. Or you might be staying, but the place will change. And the place will change because of these sort of material cultures. And sort of like so I guess that, yeah, I'm getting lost in my own sort of spiel here, but that's a very concrete thing that we do. And we found that people who use the zines then have engaged a lot with basically, this place sells nails, which will prevent a ship from ever sinking. And so players just want to engage with those things because they kind of have to, because I can't bank anything. Everything spoils within some amount of time frame. So I've got to keep engaging the world. You can't be a capitalist and like offshore account everything and like, nothing touches me. I've got to live in space. Yeah.
Just for a last minute thing to what I was saying. When it talks about like leaning into giving implied knowledge of stuff, I was inspired. I got to write a thing that is going to be published soon. That was sort of inspired from having read all of Zedeck's Thousand Islands, where I was like, how do I describe this character in a way that is implying knowledge that the characters would have of the setting in their description. And it was so you have a prisoner and they're described as old enough to know better in regards to the circumstance they found themselves in and any knowledge you might have about how they found themselves here. Really, even if you had zero knowledge of it or all the knowledge of it, looking at someone who is old enough to know better conjures that image in mind. And
This is
so,
yeah. This is the writing thing of like, don't be afraid of the anachronistic and don't be afraid of the anachronistic simile.
Yeah.
Because it's so useful. It's so very useful.
I also have to say that there was a panel already about asking the right questions in games. I did not watch it. I'm very sorry. I was asleep. So,
I did not
but
get to watch it either, and I was really excited for it. So
yeah, but why I brought it up because micro settings allow that conversation to happen, right? You have to pick the specific questions and you have to say those specific, or not really specific descriptors, but the descriptors that get the job done, whether it sounds intriguing or not in what would be considered a wider tabletop audience. Down We Go, I wrote for that for their Kickstarter recently, and I focused on 10 businesses that you'd see in this sprawling, amazing city. And one of the exercises that I wanted to do was what are the unconventional businesses that you'd run into. So I have an auction house, for example, where it says Down We Go is all about dungeon delvers. You're supposed to bring back treasure and put it on a table and figure shit out from there. And this auction house has a whole bunch of rich people who, for whatever rich people reason, want these specific items. And what I did to reflect the nature of being ultra rich and not giving a shit about other people is you have a D6 table of their mood. So they will tell you to get this thing, and we will randomly roll to see if they will actually pay you, or if they will send goons at you, or if they will decide to pat you on the head and say good puppy. Right? That's a micro setting exercise. The frivolity of rich behavior and how do you gamify that? Make a random table. I don't know
yeah.
what the madam's mood is today. Maybe she liked you today, but in an hour she might not like you. In another hour she might have forgotten your name. Best way to use a dice, honestly.
I feel like most of the proper questions for this panel can just be answered with, yo, just really get like a borderline fetish for random tables. That is gonna solve 90% of your problems.
So that sort of pulls in, I think, one question that we have in the chat. It actually ties into a second question too. First, coaching GMs to run micro-setting games, and the second one is something I really want to make sure we leave time for, about including factions. So I think we're gonna jump in on whatever. I think both those questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So just to go quick, the interesting thing about factions is I design a lot in the Forge in the Dark space, and one of the questions I got was faction game, and here I am designing the Dagger Isles, an archipelago thousands and thousands of miles away from Duskfall, and I was like, what faction game? See, the thing with factions is unless you give them enough specificity and enough good plot hooks and a sense of urgency, time, and action that they will move this way, whether you do something or not. If you have to design factions with a lot more care in a micro setting, because normally if it was a micro setting, you maybe have one or two, but you wouldn't have a faction game, right? And you could also even throw random tables are great. So I'm just gonna put that out there when it comes to factions, right? But again, you have to be, I feel at least, you have to be a lot more specific with it. Don't throw too many hooks into this broth of yours. because that's already going on a macro level of motivations of world moving shit. So
Mhm.
if you're going to bring them in, make them human
Yeah.
and make it matter. Right, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna ask because the question of like factions, in some ways, because it's an abstraction, or it's kind of a rule shorthand or abstraction. Because I work so much in system agnostic space, I don't really think about it that way. It's like, no, every character is potentially a faction. So like, yeah, and the idea, so that question about factions is that it ties into the thing about like creating an empathy or personal connection or personhood to that group of people. Why are they? So yeah, I mean, when I write our zines, it's never like, okay, there's this nation of people, there's this group of people, like there's this nation state of thieves. They're all the same way, they dress the same uniform. So I never start out writing like that and then become personal. I start by the personal and sort of like imply, so like this particular god has this thing and that thing, and he serves this particular sort of chief, but why the whys of it are personal, and the personal can be sort of like buffeted by different forces, but it is yeah. So it's writing write a faction like you would write a good character is the kind of
Mhm.
thing, right? Yeah, sorry, Brian.
Sort of the contrarian point to that, in which I view factions as the macro scale coming and crushing in on that which is intimate and familiar. So I just finished writing, God, it was like, ended up being like 60 pages of just pure mechanical crunch with narrative things. Essentially, I wrote a series of interlocking Chris Cthulhu style chaos indexes for the Dank Dungeons people for a thing they're going to put out later. And all of the faction interplay starts off with, here's some signs of the time that are showing this faction's on the ascent, but as it progresses to this next level, there is literally nothing you can do to stop, because you are an individual among a group of individuals while they are already organized. And as they grow in power and continue to exploit and oppress because they are organized and have a fundamental purpose to what they're doing, whereas you're an individual, you sort of have to deal with the growing ramifications of this group that is able to do these things on a macro scale level. So while, yeah, you are going to care when they, like, you know, kill your friend's horse because they think only people from our ethnic group are allowed to have horses now, so that horse has been, shamed by this lesser rider, so we're going to kill the rider and then we're going to kill the horse. And it's like, well, that's a personal thing, but at the same time, you now have the macro issue of, I can't go anywhere in this entire nation on horseback without inviting conflict unless I'm willing to do this, that, or the other thing. And so the faction, because I'm choosing to view factions in an entirely antagonistic light, factions exist to exploit the player character for aims that perhaps the player character might share, but like, for the case of the stuff that I wrote for like Raquel, like you could be the most faithful member of like the Heliopapist Reformation. The Pope does not care what it is you do. Maybe the Sun Pope will give a crap if you send him a bunch of money and kill a bunch of people who might be a problem for him. But whether or not you do these things, it's still going to be, doing indulgences and spreading influence and doing terrible things. The only way you can really stop a faction, stop an idea, is to utterly denounce every part of it and then take out anyone who's willing to act on those things you've denounced. And that's not something you can really easily do.
I think
I want to quick. Sorry,
I
sorry.
was the only thing I wanted to say about factions is I think as a expanding on what Brian said, I think when you have player-facing factions or player-accessible factions that people have worked for or are working for, it is really important that there be an amorality to those player-facing factions. That players may have heroic motives, they may have functional motives, but they shouldn't have a morally pure retreat in a faction in the world. They should sort of know, oh, I've got these factions, and sure they have a lot of resources, but I can't just go to them and say, hey, it's for the best. We all want the good, right? So there's always a chance that or there's always a sense that anything that they're identifying with also has problems and has people sort of motivating that, and then also have those generally opposed, never going to do you a good turn, never really going to do you a good turn factions that you might have to deal with in non-violent ways just because you don't have it a lot. You're out of choices. So
I was gonna I was gonna address the first question, which was how to hook people to the particular microsetting. And I had a thought about this with regards to or how to sort of coach GMs to care about this particular microsetting or make it come alive. The thing that we've tended to do with our artisans is that wherever you go, the place where you are now, everything that they believe or their cosmology or their magic is realer here where they are. So you kind of and this kind of ties to the factional thing that's why Brian's approach is actually quite different from mine, because the Arti project is all about avoiding the abstractions of forces. So every force in the world has a being that. So gods are like kings in space, and their influence is like diplomacy. That's true for the weather. That's true for spirits. That's true for people. So yeah, in that sense, whenever we start out a zine, I tend to write a story from that particular place, a sort of origin story, or so yeah, it's a fable, and it's a fable that's always true when you get there, and they're often contradictory with other fables from elsewhere from other zines. But yeah, so that it's I almost I don't I want to propose this as a possibility, because I mean the zines are not a system thing, but it's like Tomer Gurans, who has run a lot of our zines, did this interesting thing instinctively where he ran every zine using a different system, and whether or not there were characters between those games, it's like you've got to deal with the specificity both in the narrative but also in the abstract rules of this particular space you're in, and I guess that's how you bake in a sort of engagement.
all right, I think we're at time, so I think this is closing out with any last details or where to find you or anything like that. And Brian, I'll go with you.
Okay,
I'm good.
nothing.
Also, because my internet Southeast Asian style
Oh,
is cutting
no.
out, so but I'm good. I might just hang around Twitter and such if anybody has other
Okay.
questions.
Nothing I said is universally applicable, save for random tables. All of my work is inherently baked in with the infinite pessimism of everything everyone always wants me to write. I swear I can write happy things. And
Did you like Catlands?
I did. Catlands is not happy. Catlands has a content warning at the front because it's not happy. I will also be on Twitter if anyone wants to ask specific questions that I will totally 100% directly get back to you about. Yeah, no, that's all I have to say.
All right. Any other closing thoughts, words?
Let your players break your settings. Like, oh no, you can't nuke Neverwinter. Just let them do it. They'll have more fun. You can do that in a micro setting because you know all the consequences of if you take out the mayor. But like, just let your players destroy things. It's a even if it's a railroad track or a sandbox, just let them break things. It's better that way.
The first time I ran Enoch, which was under a different name, the players completely destroyed everything by the end of the campaign. So
Yeah.
everything I've written was what was there when they started.
Yeah. You do not lash yourself to the mizzen mast of this is orthodoxy and it must exist, it must remain static. No, let them burn it down. Let them suffer, or let them be happy that they burnt it down. Just let them do it.
All right. Thank you so much for joining today. And I know we're a little bit over time, so I want to let people get. Thank you so much, and it's been such a pleasure to talk to everybody.
Yeah.
Again.
Thanks, Richard.